Hey, this is a video that I was asked to do to kind of just go over the bones associated and structures associated with the skull, kind of run through them so make sure you're studying the right things. I'm going to do it in the order I would do as if I were studying. So the first thing is your major bones. So you want to start with the frontal bone, which is your forehead. Parietal bones are here on either side of the skull. Occipital bone, which is the back, and on the side is the temporal bone. So again, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. Golly, this is hard to do. Temporal bone. Okay, so we've got the main bones. One thing I want to add about the bones, so again, here's your frontal, your parietal is on either side, and occipital bone is the back one here. There's also these ridges that are found on the occipital bone. Those are your occipital condyles. So we've got major bones associated with the skull. The second thing I would go in order of studying would be sutures. So I'm going to take the top off to make it easier for you to see. So if you look at the top, frontal would be here, occipital would be back here. So this suture that goes side to side, that kind of separates the frontal bone from the rest of the skull, that's going to be the coronal suture. Okay, the coronal suture makes a crown. That's a good way to remember it. The second suture is this one that goes up and down that separates the parietal bones. Okay, that's the sagittal suture. So we got corona making a crown, sagittal separating the parietal bones. If we turn it to the back, if this is the occipital bone, which it is, the suture that goes around it, that's going to be the lambdoid suture. So if I just put the top of the skull on the desk, you notice this is big, it's your forehead. So coronal, sagittal, lambdoid. There's one other suture that you're responsible for. It goes around the temporal bone. So here's the temporal bone. This suture that goes around here is the squamous suture. So you have coronal makes a crown, sagittal divides the parietal bones, squamous goes around temporal bone, and lambdoid goes around occipital bone. So we've got the sutures and major bones. The next place I would learn is your facial bones. So up here there's a little bump between both orbits. That's called glabella. Next down is nasal bones. There's actually two that meet midpoint. Those are your nasal bones. Right here, this bone is vomer. It separates the two cavities in the nasal area. Right? Next is this upper jaw, which is maxilla. And then you have your lower jaw, which is mandible. Make sure I'm getting them all. The only other thing that I would be mentioning in this area is both in maxilla and mandible, you notice there's these bumps where the teeth go into. Those are alveolar margins. Okay, so we got glabella, nasal bone, vomer, maxilla, mandible, and alveolar margins. Now let's turn to the orbits. Okay, so the orbits are difficult, and I'm just going to explain as I put it close up. So if we look at it close up, so if we're looking in the orbits, the first thing is fissure. Do you notice those big cracks? One pointing down, which you can see when I do this angle, and one kind of pointing up. The one that's pointing up in the very back, that big crack, that is going to be the superior orbital fissure. The one pointing down is, if I move it this way, it's real big. That one is the inferior orbital fissure. In the very back, which you can't see on the video no matter how much I do, in the very back is a circle where the two fissures meet. That circle is called the orbital canal. The only thing else in the orbits that I might ask you about are going to be bones. There are more than 3 bones, but there's only 3 that I focus on when we're doing the orbits and doing an actual lab practical. The way I remember it is the name LESS. It goes lacriminal, ethmoid, sphenoid. So if I turn it to the side, okay, this way, good, okay, the first bone, let me just get the pointer on it, That first bone is L for lacriminal. The next bone where my pointer is ethmoid. And then further back is sphenoid. So lacriminal, ethmoid, sphenoid, LES. So inside the orbits, it's superior and inferior orbital fissure. Remember the cracks, one points up, one points down. Optic canal, which is at the very back, and it is circular. And then LES, lacriminal, ethmoid, sphenoid. It goes in that order. Okay, so that's the orbits. Then I would turn it to the side skull. There's a few things that, let me do this side, it's easier. There's a few things that are important here. So, get this in the right pot. Okay, so there's your temporal bone, there's your parietal bone. Notice that hole right there? That is the external acoustic meatus, or ear hole, external acoustic meatus. Right next to it, this process, this thing dangling, is the mastoid process. So external acoustic meatus, or ear hole, mastoid process. There's one that's considered a facial bone, but I do it from the side. It's just easier. So it's your cheekbone. Well, of course, you don't call it cheekbone, but right here is the zygomatic bone. Zygomatic bone. Then there's an orange line that separates it. The part that goes and attaches to the temporal bone is the zygomatic process. So zygomatic bone, zygomatic process. External acoustic meatus and mastoid bone. I saved mandible kind of for its own little section because there's a few things that go along with the mandible. So the first thing are these little holes. Those are mental foramina. Okay? The next thing is, if we turn it this way, we have the mandibular angle. That's right here. Mandibular, I hate trying to position this thing. Mandibular angle, it makes an angle. So mandibular angle. This right here is the mandibular notch. Mandibular notch, mandibular angle. Mandibular ramus is this area right here of the actual bone. So notch, ramus, angle. And the last one is mandibular condyle. See this place where it attaches and goes in? This is the condyle. So condyle, notch, ramus, angle. Mental foramina. Two more areas. So if I take the top off and we're looking in, there's a few things that you have to learn here. So this is the frontal bone. This is the frontal bone. This little area right here is the ethmoid bone, but more specifically on your list is this pointy thing right here. That's crista galli. Okay, so frontal, little bit is ethmoid, crista galli. This whole area right here in the middle that goes across and it looks like it's bat-shaped. I hate trying to get it so you can see it. That whole area is the sphenoid bone. In the sphenoid bone, you do have one specific thing that you have to know. Dead center, it looks like a saddle. It's called sella turcica. So again, frontal, ethmoid, crista galli, sphenoid bone, sella turcica. Temporal would be right, this little edge right here. Occipital be right down here. Foramen magnum, big hole. Last thing we do is turn it on to the bottom, because these are the last stuff. So the first one is the palatine bone. The palatine bone is the roof of your mouth, so it's up in here. So that's palatine bone. Foramen magnum, big hole. Mastoid process I showed you on the side. There it is looking from the underneath. There's a pointy structure right here. That's the styloid process. So mastoid, styloid. And all that we have left are the three holes. It goes in order. Foramen ovale, working from top to bottom. So foramen ovale, carotid canal, jugular foramen. So OCJ, ovale, carotid, jugular. And it's the same thing. I'll try to do it this way. So foramen ovale is where the pencil is going in. Carotid is where the pencil is going in. And the last one is jugular. That's it. That's all of them. I hope it helps just a little bit. I would just practice it as much as possible to help you out. All right, hope it helps.